Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We are broadcasting live from RBB's new headquarters in Miami. And for the RBBers on the phone who have not yet seen the office, it is spectacular. So I think we can all look forward to being back in the office together. But in the meantime, we'll participate via webcam and video conference as we have been for the past few months. In fact, I was thinking about today and this Predictive Communications webinar, and RBB did its first webinar of 2020 in March. And at the time we were looking at the coronavirus pandemic, which at that point it wasn't yet a pandemic, but we were looking at the issue of coronavirus and the impact it was having and what we thought we could see in the months ahead. And if you had told me then that on August 20th, we would be doing another webinar, still socially distanced and still largely working from home, it would have been unbelievable. But that's where we are. And so that's where we'll start with predictive communications. The good news is we're not talking about coronavirus today. We're talking about something that has interested us for a while. We've been working on our point of view around predictive communications, and we're excited to share it with you. The way that we're thinking about it is predictive communications serves as a bridge between crisis planning and crisis reaction. So let's get into it. So in today's session, we'll go through the now, the what, the how, and the next. And we'll go through some slides, we'll go through some ideas, we'll talk through some processes and some examples for about 30 minutes. And then hopefully we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in chat, let us know, and we're happy to answer as many as we can. So one of the things that I think is important anytime we're talking about something that's emerging or that many of us may not have participated in before is to figure out where we are at this moment. So let's talk about today's landscape. The first thing to consider when we're talking about predictive communications are human factors. And the reality is that humans are pretty bad at ignoring warning signs. And there's lots of theories as to why. We often don't pay attention to the things that we're supposed to. There's a theory called optimism bias, which suggests that we are inherently optimistic. And in business, this means we may overestimate the benefits of a project. We may underestimate the time and resources necessary to execute it. There's also a theory called risk homeostasis, as well as confirmation bias and exposure therapy. But all of this leads to the fact that we tend to turn a blind eye to risk. And we do so for very human reasons. It's uncomfortable. We like to feel safe. We like to avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and protect privilege. We don't want to be the one who's always talking about the fact that the world's about to end. And the way we understand crisis is also a little flawed in that crisis events are generally understood to be really unexpected, out of the blue, impossible to predict. They're highly uncertain situations. We look at them and consider them to be nonlinear in nature and possible, but not really likely. And actually, when you look over the past 15 years or so at major events and major crises, that's not actually the case. So looking at the crisis all the way back to, or a series of crises all the way back to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, through the housing bubble burst, the Deepwater Horizon, Equifax, to where we are now with the pandemic, all of these events were evident before they happened. There were indicators that suggested that these things were coming down the pipeline. But you had to be looking for it, and you had to know where to look, and you had to know what to look at. So in hindsight, it's easy to go back and say, we should have seen the housing market, that bubble burst. And there's been a lot written about that. And yet on the run up, there are a lot of people who didn't see it. And so the question, and one of the things we're going to talk about today, is how do we put predictors in place? How do we put systems in place so that from a crisis communication standpoint, we can start to see what's around the corner? So let's talk about what this predictive communications thing is. It's not new. Predictive analysis has been around forever, as long as human beings have been around. For example, ancient Chinese farmers developed solar calendars to forecast climate change. And so as human beings, we tend to want to look around the corner and see what's coming down the pipe. But if you go from those ancient Chinese farmers and fast forward to modern day, predictive analysis in general has picked up, and predictive technology in general has picked up as technology has evolved. So even as early as the 1940s, it was being used as part of the Manhattan Project. But really with the technological revolution, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Netflix, all of those companies we know and love, it's picked up to a much faster pace. And it's much more accessible to those of us who don't have that big data resource that come with those companies to use. So as I said at the beginning, we're thinking about predictive analysis as that bridge, or predictive communications as that bridge between crisis planning and crisis reaction. It used to be that we would develop a plan for a client, or you would develop it for an organization. You'd have your crisis plan, you'd test it, you'd do simulations, you'd update it, and it sat on the shelf until something happened. And then when something happens, the crisis manual comes off the shelf, you put it into play, go through the crisis, and it goes back on the shelf afterward. And so we were missing that middle piece. So between having the plan in place and having the processes and the protocols set, and between something happening, how do we look at what might be coming and start to offset and mitigate the potential negative impacts? So predictive analysis is the idea that we are using machine learning as a society, coupled with historical data, to say, here's what might happen. And it's probabilistic in nature, right? So it's not a crystal ball. It's just likelihoods and percentages of likelihoods. But if you apply predictive analysis to communications and you say, let's take predictive analysis and combine it with risk monitoring, then we can start to see early crisis indicators. And so this can be incorporated into the risk management function of an organization. It can capture data in real time, and it does require established benchmarks. And we'll talk about what some of those look like. So there's all kinds of benefits to predictive communications. It reduces, as we said, negative impacts. It can help mitigate them. And crises are messy and they're complicated and they can be uncertain. And predictive analysis helps us understand a crisis. So even though we may not be able to avoid or mitigate everything, at the point it occurs, we'll have seen it coming, and it'll help us be better prepared to address the issues that need to be addressed. That said, it's not a replacement for proactive PR. Proactive PR in a crisis or risk scenario is still absolutely critical to building reputation and goodwill, and to also making your values clear in advance of a crisis. At the point a crisis occurs, even if you see it coming, it's too late to build a legacy of goodwill. And so that's why proactive PR needs to be in place so that you have that to draw on when you need it. So let's talk about the how. As I mentioned, most of us don't have access to all of Google and Apple and Netflix's great algorithms and data. We're not working with big data in that way. But I'm of the school of thought that we do have access to some data, and probably more than we think. So better to go ahead and use what we have, or use what we have access to, because more intelligence is better than less. And knowing some things will help us make better decisions about other things. So let's talk about how this works. There are essentially 6 steps to setting up a predictive communications program. The first is to define your questions and baseline. The second is to look at your data sources and what you have now and what you might need in the future. The third is to build the team, because this certainly is not a solo exercise. From there, creating a dashboard, and then activating and testing are the next 2 steps. And activating and testing is pretty much an ongoing process. This is an iterative exercise in the sense that the more you learn, the more you'll know about how the process needs to be set up. And then the last piece is turning insights into action. And this is critical because data alone does not give us what we need for predictive communications. It takes the experience and the intelligence of the people who are working with that data to be able to determine what the actions should be. In fact, our CEO has written about this, and we'll talk about that a little later. So to start, and this is the first step, defining your questions and baseline. So the first thing is to decide what constitutes a crisis for your organization. And that's going to differ for every type of company, even companies that are in the same sector, and even companies that are, selling the same widget or selling the same services. So there's a risk threshold, and that has a lot to do with where leadership is comfortable and where executive teams are comfortable. But defining what constitutes a crisis is important. within that, it's also important to define, is this a crisis in my world, or is this a big deal in the real world? And what that means is there may be a media article, for example, that has a really negative headline that everyone in the company is upset about and really hates. But if it's not having an impact on sales, if it's not resonating with consumers, if it's not resonating with target audiences, it may not be that big a deal outside the four walls of an organization. So it's important to look at your questions and baseline through that lens as well. And then establishing benchmarks. So once we know what constitutes a crisis, we need to figure out where that level of crisis sets in. So for example, if we say, we know that most of our crises issues come to us and arise on social media. So then we have to establish a benchmark that says how many negative social media posts are going to be a benchmark for us to start considering this a precursor to a crisis. And that's where we get into identifying these precursors. What does that look like? Is it social media posts? Is it customer call center data? Is it sales? What are those precursors that tend to lead to crises? And the best way to get at those is to go back and look at things you may have experienced before and say, how could we have known this ahead of time? And I think you'll be surprised when you do that about how many indicators there were and how many indicators you can start to watch going forward. It's also important to engage end users early. So if the idea is that we're going to monitor for precursors to a crisis, who are we going to share that with and how do they want it? So if we're laddering it up to an executive team or a leadership group, what's the best way to do that and what do they want to see? So engaging them in the process early to make sure that you're designing a system that meets those needs and those expectations. And then the last piece is building in a rapid proof of concept for early buy-in. So figure out if there's something you could look at sooner than later that's indicative, that can share with everyone, that can prove out this proof of concept, because it can sound pretty theoretical in the early stages. And so it's important to get into it quickly and start to show that value. The next piece is defining the data sources. So there are a lot of data sources listed here. So how do you know which ones to use? I think there's two categories. One is use what you have. So not just what you have as a communicator or as a marketer, but what the organization has, what the entire institution that you work for may have access to. So it may be, marketing and communications indicators and data sources like social media, media hits, number of articles, those kinds of things, media trends. It's definitely going to be digital as well, things like website traffic, social media listening, but then it also may be things that exist in other parts of your organization. So sales information, customer service information, product development. There may be lots of different places that data lie. So when you're thinking about how to put together data sources, think about the organization as a whole. And then you can identify what your data sources are and start to map those to the program that you're designing. And I will say one thing here about Google Adwords. Google Adwords is sort of an interesting thing in the context of crisis. So it's used a lot by marketers and advertisers to test different headlines and test different creative applications. So you might be going out with a new campaign, you have two different headlines, you're not sure which is going to work better. You put them both out on Google Adwords for a week or so and see what comes back. And if one performs better than the other, great, your test is done and you know where to go. With crisis, there is an opportunity, although it's important to be cautious, that if you have two response messages or two proactive messages that are equally viable and one is no more damaging or creates no more vulnerability than the other, it may be worth using that same process with Google AdWords to understand which resonates better. Now, the trick is in crisis, we rarely have as long as a week to get the information back. So, it may be that you've got to look at information back within a 24-hour period or 48-hour period, but even so, it can be helpful. It's not an expensive exercise. And again, to get more precise, which is what we're always trying to do, it can be a good tool. The next piece of the process is to build the team. As I mentioned, this is not a solo exercise. None of us are going to be doing this in a vacuum. So it's important, as I said, to secure that cross-functional data. But beyond the data, it's important to secure that cross-functional support, because you want the support of the people who own that data and manage that data to help you interpret it, to help you translate it, and to help you access it. And if what you're asking for from another part of the organization is too much of a heavy lift, it's too complicated, it's too burdensome, you're not going to have a lot of support and the process isn't going to work. So as you're building the team, even though you may know that the sales group has access to a certain amount of data or customer service has access to another amount of data, it's important to talk with them about what's realistic for them to deliver to you and build into this process. And in that way, you're creating advocates within the organization who see their information and their resources being spread out and used in new ways. The fourth is creating the dashboard. So this can be a really fun process. There's some creativity that can be used here, but for every organization, it's going to look different based on those precursors and those data sources that you're using. So whatever question you're trying to answer and whatever data sources you have will be reflected in this dashboard. And essentially the purpose of a dashboard is to roll up everything you're looking at and put it in a format that's easy for others to understand and easy for you to understand. There is a point at which too much data is too much data. And so better to start small and start looking at what you can and layer into that once you have a dashboard built, once you have some processes in place. And then activating and testing. And this is absolutely an iterative process. This is an ongoing piece of predictive communications. The environment's going to change, your organization will change, the nature of crises will change. So it's important to recognize that this isn't something that you'll develop complete and it will stay static for a long period of time. You're going to want to understand that there are continuous improvements to be made along the way. And so the activating and the testing is a really important piece. And it's not going to be right the first time. You're going to have to plan on revising, fixing, tweaking, a number of times before you really get it where you want it, even as a first version. And then the how. So we wanted to give you some really specific examples because, again, predictive communications can get a little theoretical. It sounds a little like, well, how do I really do this? And is it really worth the time and the effort to invest? So we'll give you 3 or 4 examples here about how others have used it so that you can think about how it may apply to your organization. So in this case, a national fast casual restaurant chain was looking at indicators around social media and digital media and saw a few early, fairly minor spikes coming out of 6 states in the Southwest. So they saw an increase in negative posts. They saw some emerging negative keywords in search that they weren't comfortable with. And then they saw a slight drop in social sentiment. So any one of these on their own would not have been a major concern. We all know that these sorts of things fluctuate over time. But because they were looking at them in aggregate, they were able to say there might be something going on here. So they took it to sales and asked what they were seeing because they had not baked sales data into their dashboard at this point. And sales said, we've seen a tiny drop off in year-over-year sales, but it's not been significant. Even so, because of the trending direction, the communications team felt like it was then worth going to operations and saying, hey, what are you seeing? What's happening on the ground in these stores? Well, it turns out that operations had just launched a new shift change protocol in these states as a prototype before rolling it out nationwide. And apparently the shift change protocol was having a negative impact on the customer experience. And it was something that was wholly unanticipated. And in fact, the company felt like that shift change protocol was highly successful because it actually saved money. And so this was a way to flag early that shift change protocol may save money, but it has downstream effects on the consumer experience that need to be fixed. And so they were able to do that before a nationwide rollout. And this helped them avoid repercussions that would have come had they rolled it out without those fixes. It helped them save money and it helped them avoid all the negative blowback from customers. So that's one example. So connecting those dots between the communications data, social, digital, media into sales and into operations is important. So in this example, this is an example that is true across all crises, which is sometimes doing nothing is the best thing to do. And it's hard. In a crisis, people want to act, they want to fix it. But sometimes stepping into that space can actually create more issues in that space. So in this case, a national media outlet with deep investigative resources started running articles about tainted alcohol in the Caribbean. And it was concerning because once that national media outlet ran it, others started picking it up. And so there was some momentum to this media story, and the team involved here was seeing it grow. And so the team involved here was with a company, a hospitality company that has significant investments in this part of the world. And they were concerned about the trajectory of the story and how to engage with the story in order to present the correct side of the issue, which was that in many countries, tainted alcohol had not been found, and that rumors of it were actually incorrect. But the team was able to look at data and say, look, this story's not getting traction. Our customers aren't sharing it on social, where they're not talking about it in conversation widely, not just on our channels, but beyond our channels. We're not seeing it show up in customer search. And when we look at the media coverage, we're not seeing a lot of clicks and shares and comments. So instead of responding to the story, we took a pass. The hospitality company did not engage and was able to save itself from introducing its brand into a conversation that's inherently negative and not one with which they want to be associated, because they didn't need to go there. It wasn't something their customers were paying attention to. So in this example, a longtime vendor of an eco-friendly outdoor brand had been supplying that brand with eco-friendly products. But because the communications team was not only monitoring its company, they were also monitoring vendor companies, they were able to see that this particular vendor had had some activism and some protests outside their headquarters. Local media had covered those protests, and there were things starting to show up on media about their decision to move manufacturing into Indonesia and into a chain of factories that were known for human rights violations and child labor. Had the team not identified that vendor vulnerability was an issue for them, they wouldn't have been looking at this until it was too late. So because they saw this before it hit national media, before the activism picked up to a really great degree, and before the social media caught fire, they were able to address the issue with the vendor, ultimately deciding to no longer carry those products. And they were able to protect their own brand reputation by stepping away from that company based on that decision. And they actually got accolades from human rights activists. So that's another way to think about predictive communications, is in today's world, there is not any company that is just an island unto itself. We all depend on partners and vendors, and they can make us vulnerable as well. So it's important when you're thinking about your questions, your baselines, what your precursors and data are going to look like, the degree to which you need to look at those vendor relationships and vendor companies. And then this last one is a personal favorite. And because this is already in the public domain, we can tell you, obviously, that this is an incident with Target. And it's not a direct predictive communication story. It's an example of how predictive analysis can create communications issues. So in this case, Target had identified that there are about 25 products that women buy in combination with each other at a certain stage of pregnancy, at the beginning of their second trimester. And what Target knew is that if it could get in front of the due date for pregnant women and start getting them to either shop at Target or shop more at Target, that they were going to recoup more of the back-end benefit once the baby arrived. So looking at this combination of products, they began putting that through the system. And as an action, they began sending coupons specifically designed to pregnant women, to the women who were buying these products in combination. So smart move, smart use of predictive analysis. They were hitting the people, exactly at the right time they wanted to, hitting them with exactly the right message and exactly the right offering. One day, a middle-aged man came into one of the stores and asked to see the general manager, and he was really upset. And he had a whole bunch of the coupons with him, and he was yelling at the general manager about having sent these to his daughter, who was just a teenager. And he was really mad that the general manager and that the store had targeted a teenager with coupons that were obviously geared toward pregnancy. He felt it was really inappropriate, and it was a really poor use of company marketing resources. So the general manager, profusely apologized, and then got to thinking about it and really felt bad for the father. So he called the dad a couple days later and said, I really feel bad. I just wanted to make sure that you know how sorry I am. And at that point, the father sheepishly had to admit that he'd had a conversation with his daughter, who was indeed due to have a child in 6 months. So sometimes predictive analysis can get ahead of us. So it's important to recognize that there are risks and there are pitfalls to being too precise in predictive communications. And so in this case, Target made the decision as a company that they would still send mailers with baby coupons to this set of women, but they would include other products with those baby products, so it was less overtly geared toward women who were pregnant. So that leads us into some pitfalls. So it's important as you're going through this to recognize that there are sort of common areas that can waylay your effort or delay your effort or generally take it, off the rails. The first one is getting pulled into one-off analysis. So this is intended to be an analysis that goes over time. So you're looking at how things build and how things move over a period of time across a lot of data variables. It's not intended to be one-off analysis of a particular data set at a particular moment. Not that that's a problem. I mean, that probably needs to occur too, but that's just not what this is. It's also a risk to be working with extremely low volumes. That can lead to weak and unreliable assumptions. And what constitutes a low volume is going to depend for you on your benchmarks. So when you're looking at, for example, social media conversation, understanding what that looks like on a regular day-over-day basis will give you that baseline to understand this is our baseline, this is what our data set is, so that we need to be working with a data set that is representative of this and perhaps not less. Similarly, too much data can create a lot of noise. This is a process that can be built upon. So I'll say again, it's better to start simple, use the data you have, use what's readily available, and make sure that that's really working for you before you launch into adding a whole bunch of stuff into the process. And then we talked a little bit about the risk of missing real-world implications using predictive analysis and predictive communications. And this is where it's important to recognize that there's a human factor in all of this. There's experience that matters. You can get data paralysis. Too much data or data that's contradictory can be confusing and can actually create a drag in crisis response. So it's important to look at the data and say, we understand what it is. Does it even make sense? And how does it make sense for our organization? Data is not absolute, I think, as we all know from political polling. You can make data say what you want it to say, and as human beings, we talked about at the beginning, we're sometimes not so good at interpreting things really objectively. So just know that when you're doing this, it's a data point and it's a set of data that will help you see what may be coming, but that needs to be coupled with really smart human thinking, human experience, human analytics. So that's where we are today with predictive communications. It's been around for a while. I think we're going to see it continue to grow. As all of us have access to more data with more resources, it's certainly something we should be doing. So a lot of us now report out on our results, our performance in hindsight. I know for our clients, we give almost every client a quarterly report that rolls up everything we're doing for them, year-over-year results, quarter-over-quarter results, results against benchmarks. What we can now start doing is looking forward and saying, what are we seeing in the next quarter? What do we need to be thinking about now to be ready? And even in the shorter term, are we seeing something that's happened in the last day, in the last 6 hours, that we need to pay attention to and talk about in a wider, with a wider group of our corporate peers or our clients? So coming out of predictive communications, the next phase is something called prescriptive analytics. And prescriptive analytics is the idea that we're going to get to a point where AI is far enough advanced that not only can we see those predictive indicators, but AI will be able to step in and start to tell us which action against those predictors will be most effective. And so start to look at the variables that would play out across potential actions. That said, I still don't think that it's going to take over the role of the professional communicator. What we know is that even when we go into clients or executives with recommendations, there are lots of reasons that they may choose not to opt for those recommendations. It may be budget constraints, it may be corporate culture, it may be just personal preference, and that's fine. And so we've got to be creative, and hopefully more creative than AI in the near term, to come up with solutions that not only offer the best outcome, but fit within the organization that we're working with. So I think we're now ready to head to some questions. If you all have anything you want to ask or know about, I'm curious to see what you're interested in. Okay, let's see what we've got. Okay, so the first question, how much would it cost to implement a predictive analysis program? That depends. We've talked about the variability in the program. It can be as simple as looking at data tools you already have and putting those in place to work for you in a different way. So you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a whole new system or a whole new set of tools in order to do this. In fact, you probably shouldn't. If you have some data, start with what you have and then build from there. Once you've demonstrated proof of concept and the value behind this, you'll have a lot more buy-in for pulling in additional data and accessing additional tools. That said, it can be really time-consuming. So the other part of that equation is to think about the human factor, because again, that analysis and adjustment and refinement that needs to happen is not just something you're going to do once, it's something that's going to be ongoing. So it's important to look at who needs to do that, what resources do we need to bring to the table from a human capital standpoint, and understand cost from that perspective as well. But the short answer is it doesn't have to be super expensive right out of the gate, and it shouldn't be. So the next question. Besides predictive analysis, what else do I need to do after my crisis plan is written and before a crisis happens? Good question. So one of the things that is important, and it fits a little bit into that bridge that we built between the crisis plan and the reaction, is training. So a lot of times companies are inclined to write a crisis plan, put it on the shelf. You know, in theory, we get it, it works. We've all agreed to how this process is supposed to go. What we found is when we do simulations and when we do trainings, that's almost never the case. Back to those human factors, right? There's always something underlying, whether it's corporate culture, personality, comfort level with risk, that comes into play. We did a simulation for one of our clients, and our goal in the way we set up the initial crisis response team is usually to keep the CEO out of it, just so the CEO can focus on the day-to-day business, the bigger picture issues. And then if the crisis needs to be laddered up, it can be. In this case, the CEO had, and the executive team had said they were okay with that. But when we got into the simulation, it was really cool. It was really clear that the CEO didn't want to be excluded from that process and wasn't comfortable stepping away from it entirely in those early moments. So that was something we needed to know, because then we were able to go back and revise the process. It wasn't what we recommended, but it's not wrong. And if it's how that organization works, then that's how that should work. So there are human factors and variables that need to go into crisis planning beyond just putting down a process and a best practice recommendation on paper. Is this something that can be outsourced? Yes. I mean, you can outsource support to get it done. You can outsource guidance to get it done, but you're not going to be able to outsource it entirely. There needs to be, from whatever vendor or consultant you're using to help you with this, there needs to be a connection back into the organization specifically for that iterative process, and specifically to understand what may be evolving within the company that might change what those outcomes are looking like, or might change what the data sets that are part of the dashboard need to be. So yes, you can get some of the heavy lifting out of the way, you can get some of the strategic guidance out of the way, but there always needs to be a connect back into the company to make sure that what's being done by, again, that vendor or consultant really aligns very tightly with what's happening, because we're looking at predictive data. So it's something that's going to take some nuance and some interpretation from someone who's really close to what's going on in the moment. Okay, next question. Do you have any advice to help communications teams get company leadership executives on board for the investment? Yes. My recommendation is to start small and build in those early wins. So for example, if you right now have access as a communications team to social media listening, social media monitoring, media monitoring, go back and look at moments in which you've had issues before and see if there's any patterns in the data running up to that that you might have been able to get ahead of. And if you don't have that, just looking forward, start to look for those micro trends, like that fast casual restaurant. You know, you might right now have a benchmark that says, yeah, 4% up or down is not a real issue for us, as long as, you know, the trajectory is upward over a period of time. Start looking at some of that more micro data and see if you can start putting the pieces together. Because if you can do that, then I think executives will understand the value of aggregating early data across a dashboard. The other way that I think, frankly, I get away with a lot of introduction of new programs is to introduce it as a pilot. So this is something we're going to try. And if it doesn't work, we don't have to live with it forever. And generally, company executives are pretty happy to give something a whack if they know that they don't have to make an investment in something that doesn't work over the long term. The next one is about the presentation and will it be recorded? I believe so. Hang on one second, I'll check with IT. Yes, thumbs up. We will have a recording and we will share it out with you. Do I think AI will take over our jobs? Will AI take over the world? Maybe. You know, I don't think it's going to happen in the near term, particularly because of the kinds of things we do. So much of what we bring to the table for executives, for our partners, for our clients, is that insight based on experience, is that ability to flex, is that ability to acknowledge things like corporate culture and personal preference, and the ability to interact as human beings, which I think we've all seen the importance of over the last few months. So there may be a day when, yes, AI takes over our jobs, but I'm not going to lose sleep about that in the near term. I think there's plenty of other things to worry about. And at the point AI is taking over our jobs, you know, they've probably taken over a lot more and we'll have bigger issues on our hands. We'll just hope they're benevolent overlords. The next question was about buy-in from executives teams. So hopefully we answered that, but if you'd like to talk about it further, I'm always happy to engage. You can find my email address and my mobile phone number on the RBB website at rbbcommunications.com. So shoot me a note if you didn't get what you wanted or you want some additional thinking or just some conversation. I'm happy to share ideas. Last question, we've got a couple more maybe. Do you have any dashboard platforms or programs that you recommend? Cision, Meltwater? Yes. Yes to all of those. So here's the thing about platforms, and I actually thought about this in the context of the presentation and whether or not it made sense to call forward some platforms. The reality is there is not one perfect platform. And the way that we typically look at, particularly our digital intelligence, is across a number of different platforms, because some, like Sprinkler, are good at one thing, but maybe not so strong in other areas. And so the folks I know who really have dug into this and who do this very deeply use a number of platforms to look at the same kinds of data and then cross-correlate it to understand what's making sense holistically, where strengths and weaknesses in particular platforms may exist. That's not where we need to start. So starting with this, I would say the best platform to have is the one you have. So figure out what the platform you have can do for you, figure out what it might do that you're not using, or figure out how to leverage it for this purpose. Again, that executive buy-in is going to come a lot faster if you're not asking for additional resources beyond your own time and energy. So start with that, and then you'll start to be able to see, based on the predictors, based on the baseline questions you have, what's missing, and what you'd like to know more of. I mean, this is a little bit of a process of being inherently curious and saying, well, what if, or what about? And so as you get into the platforms you have, you'll start to go down a path of understanding what additional platforms you may need to answer the questions you have. And again, I'd say don't limit it to just what you have within your department. go explore, see what everybody else is using, see what the sales team is looking at, see what, you know, the customer call center is looking at, you know, see what finance is looking at. So see what kind of dashboards and data sets they may have, because there may be things there that are pretty easy to layer in. And just by combining two things that haven't been combined before, you're going to start to see some things that are pretty interesting, that may get you the permission and the budget to secure new platforms and start to do that combination of different platforms. And then last question, given COVID-19, how do I use predictive analysis to know what's going to happen next? So, you know, I've spent a lot of time on that, both personally and professionally. And I think this, predictive analysis is not a crystal ball. Would that it were, we would be wildly successful and rich beyond all measure. But it's not a crystal ball. It's only as good as saying, we know that these factors lead into issues like this. And I think some of where we are with COVID is we haven't been exactly here before. So it's hard to know what factors, you know, play into where we are right now. Now, that said, you can break it down. So you can say, if we've had employee issues in the past, let's work with HR to figure out whether there were any precursors. Was there, you know, were there more complaints coming in? Were there more employee issues happening? Because we know that internal communications and employees going back to work is going to be a big factor. So I don't think we're going to use predictive to have a crystal ball and say, here's the totality of what's coming. But it goes back to defining those parts of the organization and those risk factors that are most relevant for you, and looking at those through the context of where we are right now. I will say, you know, we started working on COVID at the end of January with some of our international clients and international travel clients particularly. And I will say that I don't think we're on the back end of this yet. I think it's going to be prolonged. And I think we should all be thinking about the fact that there is no getting back to normal. We may have a next normal at some point, but that next normal is probably not going to be evident for as long as a year or 2 years. So we're going to have to live in this world of uncertainty a little bit. And I think that's part of the challenge with where we are right now, is just getting comfortable doing what we do and doing it to the best of our ability in an environment that's very changeable. So hopefully that was helpful. Thank you all so much for joining. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining us. And as I mentioned, if you want to know more, you know where to find us. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.